All right, so our last idea in this chapter 19 and some additional considerations for cost, volume, profit is when we think about considering the idea that down here, we're using machines to produce our products, okay? Now, this example, everything from here up is the same as what we looked at before, okay? Contribution margin per unit, we've got our sales information, okay? But now we introduce this new information about the machine hours used to process our product or manufacture our product, okay? So every once in a while, we're going to run into an issue where we have some equipment failure, or maybe we're in the process of repairing a machine, or another type of limited resource could be labor, okay? During COVID, we experienced a lot of people leaving the workforce. We still see some staffing shortages that affects lots of things in our business, okay? So how do we evaluate what we should do in business when that happens, okay? So the idea is that assume a company has limited machine time to produce shoes and gloves because of some equipment constraints, whatever those are. We're ignoring the rangefinder because we're assuming that that equipment doesn't affect the rangefinder, okay? So maybe this is some sort of sewing or stitching equipment, okay? So without a resource limitation, we would say produce the shoes and produce the gloves. But if we look at them individually, the shoes are contributing more to our bottom line. Why? Because the unit contribution margin of a pair of shoes is $16 versus $13 to a pair of gloves. Okay. So when we think about limited resources, machine hours, we're saying that basically making a pair of shoes takes 2 hours to manufacture the shoes, whereas it only takes a half an hour for a pair of gloves. So the question is, does that change anything? Well, yes, it should. Because if we're limited on resources, we need to think about the most effective way to contribute to the bottom line. So we do this thing called contribution margin per limited resource. So what we do is we take our unit contribution margin and divide it by the limited resource requirement. So what happens to the shoes is if it takes 2 hours to manufacture that, we're really cutting that down to $8 per limited resource that we're earning in contribution margin. Now, we're not changing the unit contribution margin, we're just putting it into a different measure, okay? Alternatively, for the pair of gloves, look what happens. Contribution margin divided by a half an hour, because it takes less time, actually increases that contribution margin when we're putting those limited resources on a level playing field between the two products, okay? So really what's that saying is the pair of gloves, we can actually manufacture 2 gloves per hour, whereas over here, we can't even finish a pair of shoes in 1 hour, okay? So essentially 1 shoe. So if we're faced with limited resource constraints, we need to evaluate the contribution margin per limited resource. So the question is, which one of these should be produced when the machine time is limited? That's the gloves, and those should be produced. Now, I will say, this assumes that we can sell all gloves we produce. And with that, that's kind of the wrap up of the calculations of chapter 19. You do have a few other notes around some concepts that are covered in a little bit more detail in your text and in the notes. But as far as kind of walking through some of the primary and key calculations that I want you to know, we're going to stop the videos there.